Welcome, everyone. Thanks for listening to Yonkers Voice. Today we are interviewing Senate candidate Kat, that's K-A-T, not K-A-T-E, Kat Brezler. Why do you want to be a senator?
Hi, Adina. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody that's watching in the Yonkers Voice family. I'm a public school teacher, and I want to run for public office, specifically the state senate, because they have so much control over the public school budget. For me, I see so much difficulty in my classrooms coming up with supplies, especially when you look at what's going to happen with the GOP tax scam that's going on. For me, I can remember taking my kids to the Lincoln Center this past year. We had an amazing opportunity to go see the ballet. And when we went to intermission, I took two students to the restroom. And while they were in the restroom, I thought, what opulence would they take in? Was it the marble countertops or the brass knuckling on the leather chairs? And the door flies open and they greet me with their glowing faces. Miss Brezler, did you know they have 2 toilet paper rolls? My heart sank. That is not something that second grade students need to be noticing. The haves and the have-nots have gotten so great in this state and in this country. I think that people in Albany are very disconnected from what working class people are living through. So I'm going up there to tell them what it's like.
But the district that you will represent is District 37, is comprised of 10 towns and cities, the bulk of which are middle to upper middle class districts, the upper to middle class demographics. The poorest towns would be Yonkers and probably parts of Portchester and possibly parts of New Rochelle. So you're talking about 70% of the people that you're going to be representing are people of means. So how are you going to balance that with the poor?
Well, like we were just talking about with the GOP tax scam and what's happening with the property tax not being tax deductible at the federal level, I think that greatly impacts most of that 70% that you're talking about. And we're going to need to come up with a plan at the state level to provide them some sort of relief so that they can stay in those homes and keep this community a middle class working families.
Okay, but you've got a situation where the taxes are aid to schools is based on property taxes. Now, let's say you have a town such as Bedford, Rye, whatever. Those towns have a more affluent tax base. There was a situation in Bedford where I believe the school district had a deficit of $8 million. Now, the Tea Party contingent in Bedford said that the teachers union and mismanagement had to do with the deficit. So how, in a hypothetical situation where Yonkers also has a school budget deficit, how are you going to balance those two districts?
Well, so I think what you brought up is exactly the reason why a type of candidate like me, who has an intimate knowledge of the campaign for fiscal equity, where the Supreme Court has ruled that just what you said is actually racist and unconstitutional, that your zip code shouldn't determine your access to quality basic education. And that Bedford, I believe, didn't. There was a consolidation that they tried to do to approach dealing with some of that budget crisis. What actually was said by the Supreme Court and the small cities ruling, and we're getting very deep into the weeds now, I'm sure. Basically, the state has to come up with a plan to meet the gap needs of these districts. And I think that politicians and Albany insiders might not be so well abreast of what is actually happening. It's easy to blame the teachers union. It's much harder to look at a teacher that's not able to take the same deductions a corporation is now able to take. When they buy pens and pencils for their employees, they're allowed to take that tax deduction. But when I have to buy supplies for my kids, the tax scam that's out there from the federal government says that I'm not allowed to take that. However, corporations and test companies can make millions off the tests that my kids take, that I buy the supplies for. So you can see how there's a little bit of a disconnect. And without true transparency in our campaign finance, without ending that LLC loophole that lets those billionaires who are making money off the tests create LLCs to donate to campaigns and to influence our politicians. Without oversight like that, we're not going to get representatives.
Does this strengthen the argument then for charter schools as opposed to public schools?
Oh, not at all, in my opinion. I mean, you're talking about some of the biggest billionaire class that funds them. I mean, Walmart and the Waltons family spend a lot of money on the charter school lobby.
But that's the point. I mean, to play devil's advocate, what's going to happen? We have a looming budget crisis since the feds are about to pass this tax law, so-called tax cut, and politicians are going to be operating under a limited amount of money. That doesn't mean that you abandon the public schools, but is there a way to offset the financial issues with the public schools with charter schools?
I think what you see in charter schools are teachers working longer hours for lower wages with less benefits. We're finding that they're using approaches to have them be less qualified. I don't think that the teachers to be less qualified, the consultant firms that some of these charters are able to use have been disavowed by boards of educations. And it's another kind of loophole that the charter schools are able to use. Well, a consultant firm has been deemed inappropriate to be used by the public sector, they can backdoor consultant, be a consultant for a charter school, even though we've already deemed them in the public sector to not be behaving properly. I think that the charter school model pits community members against community members, and that's not what we want to see. We want everybody having access to quality public schools, and that corporate lobbyists with special interests should not be dictating what kind of standards and access to education people are getting.
You sound like Bernie Sanders, and I know you worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. You were a delegate for Bernie Sanders.
I was.
Is your political philosophy, would you characterize it as socialist, progressive, or other than?
I would call it a realist. I see that the great income disparity in this country, in my community, is getting greater, and that there's a so-called middle class. I don't even know what that is. I see my family, my father's a physician, my mom's a nurse, they're trying to retire, and they just can't seem to get a handle on all of these bills. And I know that my grandfather was a war veteran from World War II, and so was my grandmother. And they came home. She was a nurse, and he became an IBEW member. He created a local in Rockland County, Local 363, with his cousins and brothers. And because of that, my mother was able to go to college and become a nurse, and because she was a nurse, I was able to go to college and get a master's degree. And the difference is that even though unions have fought for living wages, the price of housing and land has not kept pace with wages. So the same sort of assets that they were able to get to, I am not able to get to, even though maybe my wage is, and we can argue about graduating into the worst economic crisis this country has seen since the Great Depression and what that is like, and also what student loan debt has been to me. My aunt went to the same school I did. I went to Lehman. She went there when it was Hunter. When she went, it was free. When I went, I graduated with debt. These types of things matter, and millennials need a voice in the process. I'm 35 years old. Millennials should not be used as a swear word against my generation. I work 2 jobs. I'm out here running for office. I show up to community board meetings. I advocate for all kinds of things like Medicare for all and campaign fiscal equity and a wide spread of issues, including doing my job every day. And so do many in my cohort. Yet we're told that we're lazy when the baby boomers let us into the greatest economic depression since, my grandparents' generation.
But how, your enthusiasm is infectious. But, again, being part of that generation that screwed everything up.
I don't hold you responsible, I promise.
But how are you going to resolve these issues in terms of what we are about to be handed? I mean, it almost seems like the deck is stacked against you.
Well, the deck is stacked against me and every other working class American in this country. The system was set up for us to never break that ceiling. However, I am not the Messiah, nor was Barack Obama, nor frankly was Bernie Sanders. But it is important to have a voice, and representation matters. And that's the difference. Young people need to have a voice in our politics and in our process. And also, we need to build a bench in the party and throughout the country as representatives. We need to have more young people having a conversation about what the country looks like in 20, 50 years from now. I often think about how to prepare my 7 and 8-year-olds for a world that exists 20 and 30 years away from now, and it's hard enough to think about a world 1 year or 5 years. It's the same type thing, the vision, the longevity that has to exist in that conversation. I think that's why we need younger voices in the state Senate.
Now, I know you listed a number of issues that you are involved in advocating for. What would you say has the greatest priority? And I'll give a number of issues that you talked about. You talked about campaign finance. You talked about environmental issues. You talked about fossil fuel issues, and you talked about health care, and you talked about education. So on that laundry list of issues, which do you feel the most passionate about?
Well, it's hard to prioritize when we're talking about education, healthcare, and campaign finance. But with a looming opioid crisis and people literally dying because their GoFundMe for their medical costs didn't raise enough money, I'd have to say bringing that New York Healthcare Act out of the Assembly to the Senate floor is paramount. It is time for us to ensure that every New Yorker has access to quality medical care. With the cuts that are going to come from the ACA, we need to insulate ourselves in New York. If we don't do that here, I'm fearful for what that means for 1 year from now, 5 years from now, and the future generations.
But again, it goes back to the old story. How do you go about doing that when you're working? Not that you're working in a vacuum, but you're working in a tough environment to be able to get proper health care to people. Especially you're talking about in poor areas where people, their health is already compromised for a variety of issues: diabetes, asthma, high blood pressure, pollutants.
Sure. And we could talk about how the need for infrastructure repair is also part of that. I mean, again, there are a lot of issues facing New York and the 37th District. And I am not going to fix them all simply by being elected. But I certainly have my finger on the pulse of what those issues are. Identifying them is half of it. The other is building coalitions and support into how to manage and meet the needs of the community.
We're about to wrap up, but what worries you most about the future for your generation?
God, that's such a big question.
It's a hard one.
It is a hard one, and I think access to information is the only way for us to build community and for us to learn and evolve. So making sure that we all have equal access to information is probably one of those biggest fears. When you talk about net neutrality and all of what just happened and the AG discovering that people, there were fake names used and emails and that, and thinking about how that may affect my classroom. Are you kidding me? That it's already hard for me to get access to the internet and show my students images and news stories and use technology in the classroom. To think of another hurdle while other communities have 30 computers in a classroom and I have barely 2 working computers. These are really big issues and we've got to talk about them. Because talking about them is the first step, right? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's at least be talking about them. That's how we start to acknowledge that they need to be changed. And that's how we start to do the things that get the change that we need.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Adina.
Thank you. Well, that's it, folks. You heard it. So when the time comes to vote, get out there and vote. Boots to the ground. This is Yonkers Voice signing off.